What happened to TV stations and what happened to the television industry in the period after they went full color roughly in the mid 1960s? I was spent only a brief period of time at one of the largest TV stations in the country, KSD TV St. Louis, owned by Pulitzer Publishing, who also owned the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I was only there for 4 months in the summer of 1966. I was a news writer, producer, fill-in guy. Pretty much got a chance to meet all the characters and collect a nice bunch of stories. And never to return to TV except briefly. I worked, did a little non-paid work for CBS in 1980 at the conventions, looking after the Mountain States, which is Colorado and some other places. And then back in 1984, which cured me forever, I worked for a television station in Kansas, covering the 1984 conventions in, I think, in Dallas and also over in San Francisco, never to return. For, I think we've discussed why it became titillation, and they wanted me to find out who the governor of Kansas was sleeping with and camp outside houses, and that, not my kind of stuff. What the television and radio got its start because of the federal government was looking around to find who could afford to put these radio stations in the 1920s and 30s and TV stations in the 1940s and 50s on the air, because it was going to be cost intensive and you weren't going to make much money for a while, and federal government knew this. So looking around, they said, who's in the communications business? And that was, of course, newspapers. So in St. Louis, you had the St. Louis Star-Times, which went out of business in 1950 or 51 or so. And they put radio station KXOK on the air at AM 630. They looked at the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, who put KWK-TV, Channel 4, with some other partners on the air in 1954, as I recall. They looked at, and by the way, the Globe-Democrat, St. Louis Globe-Democrat, which itself went out of business and was owned by the Newhouse chain, went out of business or ceased publication in the mid-'80s. I think that's right. And then you had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who was arguably the most successful newspaper in St. Louis, and ultimately the only survivor. It's the only one left. And it was owned by the Pulitzers, who were a distinguished and ethical and really good newspaper folks. And they were Democrat. Globe Democrat tended to be Republican. And Pulitzers put KSD Radio on the air in the 1920s, one of the first radio stations. And then in 1947, they had the license for Channel 5 in the St. Louis market, and they put Channel 5 on the air in 1947. They were only the second TV station west of the Mississippi at that time, and they were left alone in the market until 1953 or 54, when the government ceased giving licenses from roughly 1948 to 1953, and then resumed and so forth. And that's when you had KMOX, which was a CBS-owned and operated radio station. They put KMOX TV on after they bought KWK TV from whoever owned it at that time in 1954. So the federal government said, you guys need to, we'll let you have these But what the government gives, the government will take away if you become too profitable. And so the fellow who was running the station manager of KOMU TV out in Columbia, Missouri, which was actually owned by the University of Missouri and was an NBC affiliate, was run as a commercial TV station. And he said, they struggled, and they went on the air, I think, in 53. And they struggled, and they kind of were getting up on their feet, and then ka-ching, Channel 13 went on the air in Jefferson City. And he said, well, up to that point, we were just about to make money, and then no chance of making money for a long time. So you had the government working kind of at odds, and you had technology working at odds in these early periods leading up to when color kind of took over in the mid-'60s. And of course, that's the brief period of time when I was wandering around Channel 5 in St. Louis. And so, in that period of 53, when they started licensing everybody under the sun, the federal government, the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and that undermined the ability of these newspaper owners who were the licensees for many, maybe even most of the TV stations in the country to make a buck. And they kind of got on their feet by the early 60s. And then color comes along, and color upended everything, because you then had to go out and buy color cameras. The first color cameras that were Channel 5, I recall, $50,000 a piece. And of course, you can go we're recording this on an iPhone, which much higher. But anyway, it was very expensive, and it put them back kind of on their heels for a while financially. Now, newspapers themselves, the high point actually for newspapers, kind of unknown, was really 1963. Now, newspapers are pretty well gone now, which is, we're recording this in 2026. But they became increasingly profitable after 1963. There were 10, count them, 10 newspapers in New York City in 1963. And that industry was being pressured at that point by union problems and the normal increase in costs as well. So, but as newspaper competition decreased, profitability went way up. There's no more, there's no better place to be in business, I will tell you, than to be in a dying industry, because nobody wants to get in this, and you can charge what you want, and you can running my own newspapers, from the late 60s into the 2000s, I can tell you, that's the sweet spot. Well, anyway, by 1975 or so, TV stations had gotten profitable and had gotten their major expenses behind them. They'd upgraded and they were so forth. And at this point, the FCC steps in again. Hey guys, they said, you cannot own a newspaper and a radio or TV station in the same market, because that's uncompetitive. Now, you can argue with that, because in St. Louis, you had the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, you had the Globe Democrat, you had 3 TV stations. 2 of them were competing directly with Channel 5. You had Channel 2 and Channel 4, ABC, CBS, and so on. But they forced Pulitzer and other owners throughout the United States to sell their TV stations, or more precisely to choose. You want to be in the newspaper business, or you want to own a TV station. Well, in those days, it was a no-brainer. You wanted to hang on to your newspapers because they were most profitable and dominant. So in 1979, KSD-TV was sold and became what it is today, KSDK in St. Louis. And it went through a series of owners, including Gannett and others, as these were very, very profitable. Now, just kind of as an aside, some people will say that when an industry gets too profitable and maybe too powerful, or is heading on the way to be too powerful, in rides the U.S. government to muddy up the water and make them less profitable and pretty well not challenge the federal government in a sense of create problems. Motion picture industry went through that in 1948 when the federal government forced the motion picture studios to sell their theaters. MGM owned Lowe's and Warner Brothers had the Warner theaters and so forth and so on. And after 1948, couldn't own them anymore. Well, okay, but that also put them as not very long, because at the same time TV's coming along, which the government is licensing, and TV pretty much ran the studios, with an exception or two, out of business by the mid to late 50s and early 1960s. So, what happened after that? Well, you can look back at the very early stages of the radio industry, where NBC, which was very profitable, and CBS came along in the late 20s, but NBC was set up by AT&T and somebody else. It was RCA. I forget who the third. There were third party that set up NBC, and they in the 20s they set up a red network, which was their commercial, and a blue network, which was cultural. So you had a sort of a precursor or pre-runner to what would become NPR and PBS and so forth, and NBC was running it, and they were running it not profitably at all, but they thought that was their responsibility. Well, in the 1940s, the federal government said, you can't own two networks, the red and the blue. So they forced NBC to sell the blue network. And today the blue network, actually since 1945, has been known as ABC. So where are we today? Well, but actually by the late 70s, after the federal government, you guys got to get rid of your radio stations, cable TV was coming along. And by the early 80s, there were an increasing number of cable TV channels. And although they didn't really challenge the profitability of the local stations for a while, nonetheless, that was real competition, and TV stations by that time had become immensely profitable. 50%. In the newspaper business, we were thinking 20%, 30%. TV stations are making 50%. That's every buck you spend with them. Putting half of it in their pocket. Well, that's why TV stations became more and more valuable. By the way, a newspaper business, which we'll get to, because I bought my first newspaper in 1969, a little tiny operation, which became my flagship daily later on. But the newspapers, by the time technology came along in the 60s and 70s, which was offset printing and computers, just drove our newspaper costs into the basement. So in those days, we could make 20% easily and up to 40%. A friend of mine was running the Seattle Times in the, up until the year 2000. We'd gone to school together, good buddy. And he had a newspaper in their chain that was making 40%. He calls up the guy and he says, "Hey, and I'm looking at your profitability." And the guy says, "Yeah, you count." And he says, "No, no, 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 no. Spend more on your news, spend more on your, you know, we don't want to see 40%. We're happy with we're happy with 20 or 25%." Well, there are a couple of if you want to plug into how what happened to network and what happened to TV and so on, you need to take a look at a couple of things. First of all, you need to know about KGO in San Francisco, which pioneered, or at least is given credit for pioneering, kickers, grabbers, and orgasms. And that's all the kind of news they put on. It was just essentially porn. Or not porn, but pretty close. And they were so successful in that market that quickly spread to other TV stations, and that undermined what was already pretty underminable, the news on local stations and ultimately on network stations as well. KGO San Francisco. But also take a look at a classic movie by one of my heroes, Paddy Chayefsky, wrote Network. And Network came out in 1975, 76, somewhere along that. And it was viewed as a dark comedy because in Network the news division was taken over by entertainment, and everybody said, "Oh, geez, that's fun, but it's nutty." But ABC did exactly that 3 years later. They began looking. They put their news division under entertainment. Take a look at Network. It presaged what was happening. And of course, by the time I'm back fiddling around in TV in 1984, that's all that station in Kansas that I was supposedly reporting for. That's all they were interested in. They weren't interested in issues or anything else like that. There is a certain sadness about what has happened to our ability to inform ourselves. It used to be that newspapers were called the fourth estate. Well, the business plan for newspapers, we'll get into this later when I talk about my own newspapers, but the business plan for newspapers collapsed somewhere around 2000 to 2005. It was always collapsing after 1963. Our demographics were becoming more and more, and we're going to talk about this, but our demographics for newspapers were beginning to skew older and older. And as they did that, our readership and our hold on our younger readers became less and less. So my own studies of my own newspaper showed that people would first go for sports, then they go for comics, and about the last thing they would do would be to look at our editorial page where we were imposing wisdom, we thought, are on page one. But we'll get to that. And this is the end of my take on KSD TV in St. Louis, where I briefly served as a news writer and producer and had a marvelous time. By the way, take a look at Mary Tyler Moore show, and it certainly was very similar to what Channel 5 was in those days. And it was fun. I was well paid. And when I left in the fall of 1966, I really didn't look back over my shoulder except to say I had a good time and I enjoyed it. And I was heading back to my own comfort level, which was back in print media.